Okay, so the first chapter for Sue and Sue was counseling African Americans in specific issues that we might encounter when we are, well, all of us as white therapists counseling Black
Yep.
clients.
Yeah, something that I like in my notes that I like highlighted, I think it was at the beginning of the chapter, is, and I think we saw this a lot like throughout all of our readings in the books that, or the movies that we watched, is just the disconnect between the proportion of the percent of the African American U.S. population and the incarcerated population, and that the U.S. population of African Americans is 13% they make up of, and Black people make up 40% of the incarcerated population, which is just like such an extreme disconnect that it really doesn't make sense. And it's like, to me, it's like the biggest signifier of like, this is an issue, like why is this still happening kind of a thing. And then in contrast to that, whites make up 64% of the U.S. population, and they only make up 39% of the incarcerated population. So I don't know, just that kind of like stood out to me as just showcasing the disconnect that like still exists today.
Yeah, and Sue and Sue take a lot of time to kind of talk about where that disconnect in the therapeutic alliance happens with trust and issues forming trust because of perceptions that counselors are part of the white system and are going to use information against them, especially so if like you've got Black clients who are talking about things that have happened to them in the past, things they've been associated with in the past. Like being arrested for asinine crap is something really common for them. So like, those statistics are real.
It's like affects people in their daily life.
Yeah.
Right. And when I was home over the weekend visiting family, I was talking to my dad about that, about how, Blacks face such a more severe penalty when it comes to crimes. I had just read this chapter and I was telling him about the part that somebody was pulled over for not using their blinker and it resulted in their death. And I had to explain to him he wasn't aware of how common that was. That when Black people will see a police officer, I was like, I get scared because I've gotten pulled over for a speeding ticket. But people who actually see a police car and think this could end in my death, that's the disconnect.
Yeah.
And that's hard for some people to understand unless you show them the statistics,
I guess, mentioning the darker side of things is important. Well, I guess a slightly lighter note of more like talking about the resiliency factors of African American individuals. They're showing that high school students are African American, according to their data that they had in Student Super. 90% of African American students are starting to graduate from college, which is just behind 94% of white students. But they're half as likely to actually get college degrees too. So they still have barriers after high school, but they're also 2 to 5 times more likely to get suspended in school, have problems at school that usually stem from all the family issues, community issues, and all the societal issues. So it's, if they're given the opportunity to do really well, African American individuals are very strong people, very resilient.
Right.
Can be.
And what I liked about that chapter too is it was saying how important it is in education and schools to recognize the differences between cultures. Like I was talking to one of my friends that's a third grade teacher, and I was telling her about what I had just read about how sometimes their behavior could be seen as deviant, or they're acting out because it doesn't fit into like kind of the white educational be quiet,
right?
Whatever.
Expressive actions are seen as aggressive.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, like the way that they communicate can be very different than what the standard has been set by white people.
Right.
And like that's not fair that you are holding somebody to a standard that literally doesn't apply to them.
Yeah, and she was saying like somebody got their like not safety belt, I don't know, something that they earned taken away from them because they were just having a conversation with somebody in class, or they just interpreted their behavior as being like deviant instead of just that's their culture.
Right.
So it was really interesting to talk about that, how in the education systems that really needs to be recognized. All right, do you guys want to move on to chapter 16?
That sounds good.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's anything else that like really stood out.
I know. Especially in terms of like how does this reading relate to the counseling field and process? I'm really thinking more about that communication styles.
Yeah.
And especially from like my perspective as not just a woman, but also a white woman who's been socialized to kind of see Black men as sexually aggressive, as and aggressive in general. Like, how does that look in crisis situations? Especially knowing that like biases take over because they're easy and they're quick. And when you perceive threat, you're going to move towards your biases. So like, just the amount of work we have to do with unpacking, like this relationship in this moment here and now, like that's going to be a lifelong thing. And really impactful too, because like in safety situations where we could, in theory, Baker Act someone, that's incarcerating
Yes.
someone.
That could lead to other legal consequences.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Employment consequences, losing your job for missing work or something like that. Like
Family consequences, like losing your like support system. Like a lot of times, that's the only, like in the book I was talking about how there's like such a sense of like family and community, because a lot of times like you have to rely on that as an African American. And like, can you imagine if you don't have that anymore?
you, especially because of stigmatization of mental illness,
Right.
And like the impact that has on the unit. Yeah, like you risk so much, or coming into therapy and then to have that violated. Just showing up is such a risk, and such a move, and like even perceived trust mistrust. Like
DCF,
they showed up.
Am I worried about, I have my extended family live with me, there's 10, 12 kids in the house, that might work with their family. And I was reading out like that, it's something to talk about. Talk with your clients about, how is their family structure. And not, to try to fix the family structure, but just to understand it.
Work with it, foster the strengths that are there.
Yeah.
Possibly take on many roles.
Especially assessing relationship to social systems, where if they have encounters with like DCF or something, then understanding as counselors, like, oh, that's not my role. Like, that is your role.
Yeah, that's part of it.
Yeah, a little more problem solving.
For sure. Kind of going based off of that, sorry, last thing, and then we can move on, but I thought it was something that I just didn't really think of, the practical application of learning the racial and ethnic identity models that we talked about before. How I was talking about how it's so important to not only be aware of your own, where you are at as a counselor in that model, but also be exploring where your client is in the model, and how that's gonna obviously, and it makes perfect sense. I just hadn't really thought of how you would use that in counseling, how you have to understand that, because it's going to affect the techniques that you're using in counseling, and how you're approaching things. And so that was something that I thought was really interesting that they mentioned in this chapter, is just continually exploring that with your client and yourself, because that's going to change the nature of counseling.
Right. I thought it was really interesting how it was saying that Black clients that don't mind working with white counselors are typically in the conformity stage.
Conformity or the later stage too, right?
Oh yeah, probably.
The integration.
But that when the counselor asks maybe, how do you feel about working with a white counselor, those in the conformity stage will not even think that could be a barrier,
right?
Because that's dominant culture.
But in other stages, they might be well,
I don't know. Yeah,
you oppress my people,
right? For
so
sure.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
so it is really important, Barb, like you were saying, to constantly check in and assess, because they could develop into a different stage, and if we're not aware that that's happening,
that'll
change
change
our techniques
and the relationship too. If you start to sense a
more aggression or something from somebody, it might not feel like a personal
microaggression.
thing.
Is very advancing.
Some transference from their week. Maybe they had some kind of racial experience. They just need somebody to vent it out with that was a white person.
And so then checking in with our own comfort and identity, and being able to depersonalize. Depersonalize those moments, but also understand our impact in the system.
Yeah.
Which is a tough balance.
It's a really tricky thing.
Yeah.
It's really tricky. Complicated for sure.
Okay.
Anything else from this one that you guys want to talk about?
I mean,
I think we could go on all day, but
I
I
know.
think
plus so much of the Rothenberg and 13th, this will come up again.
Really, it's reiterated.
This was a good stepping stone for the readings to come.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the next chapter was 16, which was counseling Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Yeah, I thought that this one was really interesting because same with Blacks, that form of collectivism, that we need to be asking questions sometimes, not just like how does you feel about this, but like how does your family feel about this, and how does this affect members of your family? I thought what was so interesting is that they will talk about their mental health issues in terms of physical ailments. So I'm so tired. I ache. But I can't eat.
Yes.
I can't sleep because it's so stigmatized in their culture to look at a mental illness. It's like a deficiency. It brings shame to their family. So shame, we read, was a familial thing. That guilt is more like individual, but shame is for the whole family. So I think that that's so important. We can't just say, what's the history of depression in your family? Or are you depressed? They're going to be like, what? No. I told you I can't eat. I can't sleep. I'm tired. So we need to be asking more questions about that and get on their level, kind of.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting too, and how just like a little question, like how you said, instead of asking like how does this affect you, but how does this affect your family? Like that's such a minor, like simple question to ask a client, but it's so important when working with like different kinds of populations. And back to what you're saying about like the depression, asking about like, oh, do you have a history of depression? I thought it was so interesting that in the book it mentioned like talking about that, and how a lot of times clients will say, oh, well, I'm sad, but I'm sad because I have all of these health like ailments. And that's just like such like a minor but like really important like distinction that as counselors we need to be aware of to like pick up on those things and be able to work with that. So interesting.
Yeah, those somatic symptoms are interesting. Yeah, like you were saying, like sometimes like a cycle, like feeling one way, like emotionally affecting like, the physical health, and physical health affecting the emotional health. And I thought it was just cool, like the focus more on the holistic like wellness of the client, where like having that collectivistic approach where you don't just like, oh, ask how are you feeling, but like the whole family system, but then also like ask about like how's their wellness and their physical health, and how's that like trying to understand those timelines. Like, have you been having these stomach aches for this amount of time? Maybe there's like a timeline where maybe they had got fired.
Instead of onset of mood, it's onset of your stomach ache. With the non-separation of physical from mental well-being. So just understanding like that IMIC approach. Approach. One thing that I took away from this chapter and kind of noted was just the extent to which within group differences matters here, because Asian Americans encompasses Filipinos, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Pacific Islanders, Indian Americans, Korean, Vietnamese. The list goes on.
They're all so different.
Yeah.
Like all their cultures are so unique.
Where you could do a Sue and Sue size textbook just for interventions for Asian American clients. So just in terms of the cultural competence model of awareness, knowledge, skills, I feel like this group is something that like continuing education is going to be really important, especially as more they talked, Sue and Sue made note about how we're not totally sure of the extent of mental health problems within this community, probably because of we're not capturing the right sort of symptoms and language and shame and reporting, more so than in other communities. So like as assessment tools get better for that, then we're going to need better intervention tools. Like we don't know the extent of this yet. And so I think that in terms of cultural counseling, this group is going to really take off.
Yeah. And I felt when I was reading this, like this is the group that I probably know the least about. And like you said, that there's so many different, it's not just Asian, it's, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, but there's so many, and depending on what they are, they have a whole different experience. So like, if we have somebody come into our office that appears Asian, we can't just say, Asian. We have to know what they identify as and kind of their historical context and everything like that. So this is definitely one I want to research more.
Mhm.
And like you said, there could be a Sue and Sue size book just on this.
Mhm.
Your points about like understanding, just like the intricacies, not intricacies, but yeah, intricacies of like the individual like cultural groups that they identify with. Because Sue mentioned that like, even though Asian Americans have like a high resiliency rate, like doing well, like those that do really well. But they said something like basically there's like a pretty big discrepancy.
The
where-
stratification.
Yeah, where like those that don't do well, like those
Extreme
from like
poverty.
So many living in poverty, yeah.
like much higher poverty rates. So
Mhm.
and I saw also wrote down the term co-construction when
Mhm.
working with Asian clients as well. I guess just as we come to the session, we're not there to reconstruct their life, but co-construct, so to speak. Do you guys have any?
Yeah, I thought that was really. I wrote that down too because I thought that was interesting because part of it is like, a lot of times with Asian Americans, they prefer a more like direct approach from the counselor, but that doesn't mean like not to collaborate or not to still like demand or like tell the client what to do. It's really important to still have that like collaborative kind of approach.
Autonomy looks different,
Yeah.
but it
Different.
doesn't
Exactly.
make it.
And we need to
Exactly.
acknowledge that we're, experts on our
Mhm.
field of mental health, but they're the experts on theirs.
Yeah.
We need to treat them like what they have to say about their culture and their
Mhm.
experience is like new to us.
Yeah.
Even though we have maybe read things about it before, their experience is completely different. So we need to collaborate, take what we know with their experience and then use that to form a treatment plan for best approaches.
Yeah, for sure. Something that like really applies to all of these chapters, but is that it's such a fine balance of like understanding where somebody like how someone's culture affects them and us in the counseling relationship, but not letting that overtake the way we view them so much that we only associate them with their culture. You guys know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Like each person, like just because normally or typically Asian Americans prefer a more direct approach, like that doesn't mean that every single one of our Asian American clients like wants that. So it's just like that. I feel like that's just something that I really want to like continue to explore on understanding is finding that like balance between the two.
And that's Sue and Sue's whole point about acculturalization and assimilation. That sort of assessment, which goes into the RCID model,
Yeah.
like that has to be an ongoing thing. And like I think in terms of that, taking that the cultural orientation model, the process oriented one, and cultural humility of like.
Yeah.
I'm here and I'm here to help and I want to learn as much as possible and I want you to help me out in that process. Like the onus isn't on you, but like I'm not going to know everything. Like that's going to
Be
happen.
humble as a counselor.
Yeah.
And to acknowledge too that yes, we need to assess where they're at with their racial identity model and things like that, but they could also be coming in for something unrelated. They could be coming in because they're having
Grief or something.
Yeah.
right.
and even though we need to figure out how their culture ties into that, like if they're having marital problems, what the roles are in their family, stuff like that. If we focus too much on their cultural background when they're like, I just came for something else.
Yeah.
Like say they're they're born in America and they're people that they feel like their race doesn't really affect them. They might get annoyed that we're focusing too much on their culture, and they're like, "Yes, I'm Asian. So you see you see it. Okay, let's move on."
That's such a good point. Go ahead, Sarah. Sorry.
No. Just that there's the point about counseling should be kind of time limited for this group that they didn't talk about for other groups, and like maybe culture comes up later, but right here, right now, that's not my presenting problem. So like, how do you like balance the two? How do you know as a counselor? That is a really good point.
Like it's solution focused a lot of the times, and something like you mentioning that a lot of the time, or not a lot of time, but in the book it said that some Asian American youth lack awareness of like the racism and discrimination that they face because it just like is different, and a lot of times like I wrote down that they minimize like the discriminatory behavior. So that's a really good point because if you're focusing too much on that, it's like then you end up like stereotyping pretty
Right.
much.
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
like they may not even be at that point where they're aware and experiencing that. So
Yeah, and I think that goes for, a lot of these other chapters too, and different groups that, of course, culture plays a huge aspect, and this is not something we should ever ignore, but we need to figure out to what degree for some of these
Mhm.
people. Maybe this is something that, they've accepted their culture, they don't feel like it plays an impact in their life, and they would rather just not sit and talk about their culture. They want to talk about, like, since it's time limited, what can we do to fix this issue?
To what point does cultural competence kind of become an obstruction?
right,
In that,
exactly.
and that, but then it's just like being good enough at what you're doing to say like, okay, you've dealt through this. We don't need to right here, right now.
Yeah, and just because we're not talking about it with the client doesn't mean that we aren't like
Mhm.
still exploring that, you
Mhm.
know? So like even if we're not discussing that like explicitly with the client, doesn't mean that that's not something that like we're considering. I think that's probably a big part of having cultural competency.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
You said earlier, Sarah, connects to that.
Yeah.
You said like autonomy looks different for different clients.
Yeah.
That kind of just was like a theme of pretty much what you guys were all just saying there. That just kind of I kept kind of hearing from what you said earlier that if we push too much of knowing their culture or not knowing their culture, it it affects the autonomy of the client and our ability to get them going.
Does anyone else have anything to add about this one before we move on?
One last thing. real quick.
Yeah.
When working with college-age Asian American students, I found the point about there tends to be an increased rate in parent-child conflicts when the students go to college. I guess because family traditions and they start developing their own traditions as college-age individuals. So there's, as clinicians, something to take into consideration.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well, and it ties into the next chapter because I think that what was it? What are they called?
Latin,
No, not Latinx. In the
Latinx.
book, it said
In the book, I found that really interesting that in the book it's Latino / Latina,
yeah,
but I was like, oh, this book's a little outdated.
yeah, and I just
It
feel
is a
like
2016
depending
edition.
on what
Yeah.
I read, it's different. So
Yeah,
you know,
Latinx.
excuse me if I say something
No.
that isn't up to date. So
What's Latin?
It's gender neutral for Latino,
Oh.
Latina.
Okay,
So it's
that's what I kinda-
Latinx.
Mhm.
But also
I
like
haven't really read that too much.
it's. I mean,
Being honest.
Sanabria brought it up. I see it in a couple of bits of
I've
literature.
seen it a little bit. Yeah.
But also, like, students do start the chapter with, like, some clients do not identify as Latino.
Yeah.
They're going to identify with, I'm a Mexican American, I'm Colombian, right?
Cuban,
Right.
yeah, Puerto Rican.
Yeah. So that's the, like, where do you identify?
Yes.
And how do I honor your identity right here, right now?
Right.
So I wouldn't really call myself Latino. I would say Cuban American or Hispanic.
Yeah, and it's different. That was like the first thing I wrote down is Hispanic versus Latinx versus American.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it's like it just like, and that goes back to like the race versus ethnicity also because those are different things, and I think that's a lot of times where like with Hispanic and the Latinx community it gets kind of muddled. Is that being Hispanic or Latinx, like that's an ethnicity, not a race. So it's kind of like it's
Yeah.
confusing.
it is.
It is
confusing.
It's confusing for people who even identify as such.
Yeah, and we'll
Yeah.
talk about that when we hit the Rothenberg readings.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
So this chapter for Latinx,
Yeah.
counseling individuals who identify as Latinx, I thought the main things that stood out to me was the underutilization of mental health services and really any services in general in the U.S., especially if they're undocumented or they have family members who are undocumented. I can't imagine, and I've never put myself in those shoes before. I've thought, how hard it must be to be undocumented, but in terms of, coming forward with sexual assault or spousal abuse or needing anything really,
Even going to the doctor.
everything is scary.
Yeah.
And I don't want to, like, to add to that point, right now in the big immigration debate that Doc has come into, that,
Yeah.
border camps are bringing up, is women are unable to come forth to courts with reports of domestic violence because there's abusers will be like, I know you're undocumented
Mhm.
and I can deport you in a heartbeat.
Mhm.
And that is that's psychological
Terrifying.
torture on top of
It's
physical
trauma,
abuse.
yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
This, I know we're on the Latinx chapter right
Yeah.
now, but it also, ties into the next chapter about
Mhm.
counseling immigrants and refugees.
Yeah.
And I just think that living with that kind of fear,
Mhm.
I mean, living just as a U.S. citizen, you have so many, everyday kind of struggles, but
Mhm.
with this fear that at any minute you and your family could just have to get up and go. But we'll get more into that in the next chapter.
Yeah.
But for this one, something else I thought too, like it was saying in one of the examples about how a lot of families will want to raise their children as American, not teach them Spanish, kind of like let go of the culture so that they're more like normalized, they feel more adjusted. But then in the schools, they have an issue identifying with, the Latinx population because they don't speak Spanish, they're not whatever enough, but then also with the white population, they feel kind of, what did it say? Some analogy, it was like in between two
Stranger.
straddling two lines, but not in between, or not on one of them. Something like
Yeah.
that, like straddling in between two
Yeah,
lines,
yeah,
but
yeah.
not really a part of anything.
Of either of them. It's like you're
Yeah.
a little bit too much of this to be a part of that group, but you're also not enough to be a part of that group too.
Yeah.
Alien into world. It was something that was like related to language.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's like socially, legally, and like economically, they're just like trapped. Where I had a discussion when I was doing my pre-private Hispanic family counseling. One of the days when I was doing marketing at the, I was helping out the Puerto Rican fair that.
At the consulate?
It was not the consulate. What's his name? Representative DeSanto. Darren Soto put it on. His name. Anyways, I was talking to this lady, and basically how somebody's undocumented. They go through high school. They might get their high school diploma, but because they're undocumented, they don't have a social security card, and they don't have a social security number, so they either can't get a job or they can't go to college. And so there's these constant roadblocks where these barriers where if a high school student had the opportunity to get their high school degree, maybe become a U.S. citizen. Oh, that's the other part too. Not having the citizenship, it's like they're just constantly stuck in limbo where they can't report crimes, they can't go to college, they can't get jobs, and so we have this large percentage of our population that's just trapped, stagnant, and like limbo. It's like almost like a real world purgatory where they have no rights, they have no options. It's terrible. So
It's
understanding the mental health of that. That's
barriers and how we as counselors help navigate those barriers. And like, I want to talk a little bit about cultural strengths because we've been talking a lot because it's real, like a lot, we could talk all day about the struggles. So there's the
Yeah.
I'm really
The
bad.
family.
I've been reading it like I'm bad at it. And I wish I were better. But valuing extended family, valuing the impact of spirituality and religion, and also understanding how that's going to look like Catholicism is really big in for Latinx clients often, but like their Catholicism looks different than my Catholicism as someone who practices in majority white parishes, even though it's a universal format. So understanding like that and valuing those kind of strengths is something I want to be aware of for myself moving forward.
And I liked how it was talking about in the strengths, how it goes like full circle about how a lot of individuals who are Latinx, they have these requirements at an early age. They have to, sometimes they even have to miss school. They have to miss things in order to be there for their family, maybe work for their family. But, later in life, they all take care of each other. It was saying that sometimes someone will be like a second mother to their sister, or like their parents will continue taking care of them as they grow up. And that it all, it's give and take. You know? So for all of the things that the children do for their family when they're younger, their parents come around and they all kind of help each other out throughout their lives.
Yeah. I think it's important as counselors to like take those things into consideration and make sure, at least I know for me, is to not try to like impose my own views of what family is or what gender roles are, what like spirituality or religion is, and that's like really hard to do. But instead of wanting to like change what somebody's kind of like culture is, because like even like with their gender roles, like a lot of times I read that and I'm like, oh, like, you know, even as somebody that identifies as Latina, like I don't particularly like subscribe to that. But that doesn't mean that as a counselor, like I can't like impose those beliefs.
Yeah.
You know, you have to like explore that with the client, understand like where they're at in those different, like how they view their family, like how they view their spirituality, like all of those things. So that's like something that I really took from it and was important for like me personally as a counselor.
Thank you for sharing that, because it's like, how do you, especially because you relate to identify with the group, how do your values of like egalitarianism, which kind of,
Right.
how do you not impose that on
Right.
someone who is like you?
Right, exactly. How do you not do that when you have, you know, a client who's like, oh, well, you know, my role as a female, as a mom, as the wife is to be like submissive and just like, you know, whatever. And obviously like my personal initial reaction is to be like, you don't have to succumb to that. However, like that's not being
That's
a
not
cultural
healthy.
competent counselor. Although I may think like, oh no, I'm advocating for women, but that's not exactly it. You have to look at it through that other lens. And so that's kind of something that like stood out to me, especially because I do identify with that group. And it's like, sometimes you can get caught up in like, oh yeah, like we're the same, but like we're not. So it's just something that's like very interesting to me.
Yeah, as I was reading it too, it's hard to put your own beliefs aside, like how I was saying in this culture, you know, the male is the dominant one in the household, and he makes the rules and blah blah blah. And I'm reading that, and I'm like, oh, you know, I hate that. I don't like that, you know. But then I'm like, whoa, like I felt it coming up.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, especially that one saying that the man who was unemployed, that he would get physically violent with his family and had anger issues, and you know his children didn't listen to him, the wife didn't listen to him. I'm like, so what? You know.
Right.
So that's an important thing that came up for me, that I need to realize that that's part of the culture. I may look at it like, you know, that's an emotionally, physically abusive relationship, and you know all my knowledge about abusive relationships is coming up in my advocacy, but like this is part of the culture we need to recognize. It's not wrong. You know, I mean, I definitely don't advocate physical violence or any violence, but like it's not wrong. It's their way of doing it.
What's the way of fixing this, of healing this system? Whereas if you were working with a white family, that might look a little bit different.
So
Healing looks different.
Yeah.
There's healing to be done.
And it's incorporating like those gender roles in like treatment, like with your clients, like even like with that example that you mentioned of that the man who was like becoming angry, is like you can like talk about that, like, oh well, tell me like in your household what that looks like for both of you guys, like what is your role as the head of the household, as the father, whatever. And like letting the client kind of like explore that too, because then that makes it easier to like to bring that into the conversation of the healing.
Right. Letting them give you the picture rather than
You assuming.
drawing it yourself.
Yeah, that's cultural encapsulation.
Right, for sure.
We'll touch on some more of this with the immigration refugee chapter coming up. Is there any final statement specifically for Latino Latinas?
Oh, one thing is just like language barriers.
Right.
I mean, obviously that's something that like I'm aware of, but just really thinking about the impact that can have on somebody, and specifically like in the counseling environment, how important it is. I found it interesting that the text was like, don't use children as interpreters.
Yeah.
And that was something that was like really practical and tangible for me to like take away from that, because it's not something that you're like, oh yeah, like whatever, you know, a lot of times the kids are in school so they speak better English, like they can just be the interpreter. But that's not going to be like a good solution to the problem. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the interpreter aspect, because same with, I feel like we're kind of two birds with one stone with this, with the Latinx and then the immigrant refugees. A lot of them have the same kind of things that they cover.
Right.
So for the interpreters with that, I thought it was so, I had never thought about interpreters in counseling before. And just talking about the different things about how the interpreters can be so affected by what they're sharing.
Yes.
And that we need to work with the interpreters too, you know, as counselors, to make sure that they're okay. Talk to them about self-care.
Yeah.
You know, the stories that they're sharing from the other people might bring up things in their own lives, you know, and if they're not trained in any type of mental health, basic whatever, you know, they're gonna have a really difficult time.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting too, saying that sometimes the clients form a better relationship with the interpreter, and that as the counselor we should respect that, you know, and that sometimes we're gonna feel like kind of like the odd man out. But I just had never really considered any of this interpreter stuff before, and I think that it's so important to think about.
Yeah, because that's going to hold back somebody from, there's already so much that's holding somebody back in this population from seeking help and seeking counseling, that is just another added thing. Like, okay, well, I don't speak very well English, so like, how can I go see somebody, you know? So I don't know, it's just like, it was just really interesting, like being aware of that kind of stuff. That's like a resource for people.
Yeah.
So as we move on to this next chapter for immigrants and refugees counseling, you know, I know we covered a lot.
Chapter 20, I think.
Oh yeah, the next one is multiracial.
Oh, so sorry.
And then the one after that is immigrants and refugees.
Should we just go into the immigrants and refugees since we're already kind of on the topic?
Yeah,
we can do that.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Something that I thought was interesting, just like a statistic, was that you know, there's so much obviously stigma and stereotypes about immigrants and refugees, but that 39% of undocumented immigrants came before 2000, I think. So that many are like well integrated, and that's just like a stereotype that we hold here in the U.S. is that like there's been like such an influx recently of like all of these like undocumented immigrants, and the president's calling them like rapists and stuff like that. So obviously that doesn't help. But that like the reality is that a lot of undocumented immigrants just like have lived here for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, and I can't imagine what it must be like to be them that are so integrated, that have been here for so long, and then every time that, you know, a terrorist attack or something happens from somebody in their group, suddenly they're looked at like the newcomers, like the enemy among us.
Yes.
Like, oh, what are you doing here? And it's like,
I've been here for 10
I've been
years.
here for like ever.
Yeah.
Like, I have a job, I own a home, you know, like,
Yes.
and we, you know, they're still stereotyped and feared.
And they're less likely to commit crimes than somebody who was born here.
I loved that. I mean, people that, I mean, you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, people are always saying, and especially in politics, and, you know, have that Trump quote saying that, you know, the bad ones are coming here, and the rapists and the murderers and blah, blah, blah. But, and I always thought, oh, yeah, you know, previously before this class, maybe a lot of them are criminals. I don't know where this came from. But now I look at it, and I'm like, of course they would commit less crimes. They're they're immigrants. They're you know, doing anything they can to stay here
out of the
because in their country they're
being persecuted.
Exactly, it's literally fighting for their lives.
Yes.
So why would they go and rob a bank or you
and
know,
get thrown in? You know what I mean?
They're not going to risk their
stupid.
lives. Yeah, risk their lives traveling to the U.S. just to
Set back to wherever.
Like, of course, crime happens, and you know, not every immigrant or refugee is gonna be picture perfect, whatever. But of course, it's less likely.
Yeah.
Like, duh. And when I read that, I was like, that makes so much sense. So like, whenever that comes up again in conversation, now I feel like very confident in
being able to
explain this.
Yeah, and it's really sucky that like that's the picture that people have that we've painted like as a society, because
Like, they've come here to just, you know, wreak havoc in our country and screw up everything.
Yeah, right.
Especially tying into that underutilization of immigrants do have access to social support, social programs through the government, but they're not going to use them for fear of just a family member being reported in connection with them. So how, as counselors, we navigate that, because this chapter also talked about, like, gave us a very set list of emergency rooms have to serve whoever shows up.
They're allowed to ask for interpreters.
They're allowed to ask for
Yeah,
interpreters. Agencies also see clients. I didn't write down the specific one. But like, that's knowledge and skills for us. Like, we have to take on that role of we're just here to talk about your feelings. Like, no, you have to know practical laws in your community. You have to know local resources. You have to make referrals not only for fellow therapists, but I know this agency, and they'll help. They'll help you. They'll help you out with food because you're not applying for food stamps for a legitimate fear that you have.
Right.
And I always thought, like, when it came down to providing resources and all that, I was like, oh, that's the job of a social worker. You know, like, we're trained differently. I don't need to know these things.
Right.
But, you know, what if somebody comes to us that is an immigrant and it was so hard for them to come here in the first place, whether it means of transportation, just getting up the courage to come. And the message to them is basically, we can't serve you.
Right. So now you have to go find somebody else.
Likely they're probably not going to. It took them so much to see us that we need to have this in our toolbox. You know, we may not always use it with every client, but we need to have these resources and these skills and knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. Something that I thought was like really interesting that I hadn't thought of was making sure to reiterate confidentiality with this population because that is so important to them since they are fearful of being deported, or if they're like a refugee, you know, obviously they have like a lot of trauma that they've gone through. So just reiterating that like our conversations with like counselor and client is confidential. And like obviously that's a given. We have to talk about that with everybody. But I just thought it was like a different perspective of being able to talk about that with this population as like a trustworthy kind of like building kind of a thing. Because that means a lot to them because they're scared.
Especially one thing that really struck out for me in this chapter was doing the pre-immigration or pre-refugee assessment of functioning, because like there are things that this transition to a new country, to just a foreign land, you will not go back to that pre-existing level. And so in confidentiality and establishing that trust and taking that time to build those most basic stepping blocks, when you unfurl their story and understand, then you also have that relationship to say like, things are tough and like you might not return to the life you had before. It's really hard news to deliver to someone. It's something they probably already know, but like just to sit there and commiserate with this population in a trusting relationship that you've taken that time to build. I think that's a really important factor from this conversation. So working in that level of assessment of what was it like before and what was it like now. We should do that all the time, but like for this population.
No, that's a great point. So that also connects to understanding, like, for example, say somebody earned a bachelor's degree in their home country, but the United States doesn't recognize that degree in, you know, law, medicine, you know, whatever. So they might have spent, you know, 10, 20 years working as a lawyer, a doctor, you know, psychologist in Syria or, you know, wherever, and they come to the U.S. like, oh, well, you know, sorry, we don't recognize those degrees. So they go from, you know, somebody who's relatively confident, you know, economically stable, they leave their country to immigrate, and then, you know, I mean, they might have more resources than somebody else, but still, it's another like set of barriers where they thought they might be able to be a little more successful, but then
like we're dealing with identity issues, the loss of self.
And that's another important point from Sue and Sue was what's their level of bereavement for this process of you know, survivor skills,
the life they used to have, the people they left behind,
their occupation, their family. Because a lot of times, if you're a refugee, I mean, you left your family, and like Sue was talking about how there can be a lot of guilt too associated with that. That like you left and to, you know, survive, but like your friends and family may not have come with you, and like it's just like a lot to have to kind of work through. Anything else you guys want to touch on with this chapter?
I think
lots, but in the interest of
Right. I know.
Okay, so we should go back to the multiracial.
Oh yes, right.
This chapter struck out to me the most because my mom is she's such a good person, but she's just very unaware. And I've heard her before say things like, how sad, you know, that poor child,
Like
people
talking
look
about
at
like
him,
multiracial.
or like, you know, she sees a black and white couple or something. She's like, there's always just the fear that they're not going to turn out. They're going to look funny, you know? I'm like, Mom, you know, I used to just be like, oh yeah, there is the fear they're going to turn out funny. But now I'm like, why?
They're people.
She looked, and I had to educate her on this, of course, but previously she's looked at them like they're, something to sympathize, like they're this creature, and that's what it was saying in the textbook. People don't know what to make of them.
Yeah.
That the first question always is, what are you? What is your dad? What is your mom? They're forever, multiracial people are forever having to defend themselves. Their bodies, they always have to, people think it might be an interesting topic of conversation that, they've never thought about before.
Right.
And it's just like, so tell me, what are you? Like, all curious and excited. But somebody who identifies as that is probably so sick of it.
Mm-hmm.
But, going, again, with the other ones we talked about, not belonging to either. And what stood out to me the most about this is when you have parents who maybe the dad is black, the mom is white, you aren't really, as a multiracial person, you're not really learning about your multiracial identity. You're learning about the black one and the white one. But if your parents aren't multiracial, it's very hard to learn about what it's like to be mixed, to be both, and to respect both. And like it was saying how, it started so many years ago that one drop of
blood,
makes the whole
Hypotension.
So like we just assume that somebody's, and I have too, that somebody that's mixed race is black. But they're 50-50. They're also white.
Right.
But why is it that the black culture takes away the white one? What if they want to say, I'm white? Somebody's going to say, no, you're black. So there were so many interesting things to consider with this that I had never thought about before.
And something, like not being able to identify with either one, but one thing that struck out for me in this chapter was just the amount of available strengths once you are able to come to like this understanding of like, multiracial people can be a chameleon, or their identity is determined by who they're sitting with today. Or they're actively choosing which identity they're going to go with and how they're going to define their identity. And I think that's really like a cool level of flexibility. And when they do the studies of like people with who are biracial, who are multiracial, can say like they can navigate cultures better.
Global travel is easier.
Global travel is easier. They can take multiple perspectives for issues, and like that's like a really hopeful point and such a cool thing to foster in counseling, and something to kind of like keep moving forward. Of like like there's a lot of hope out there because as we keep as cultures keep assimilating and acculturating here in America, and as we do across the globe, like maybe this is a point of hope. Where we're all kind of multiracial in the future, and like that's a beautiful open perspective.
And as counselors too, to make the counseling strength based, to not look at it like how I started it, like my mom looking at them like they're whatever, that they're deficient or something, but that in fact they are sometimes even better off than those that just identify as one. They can be chameleons. They can, there's so many strengths that come along with that. And as counselors, we should be able to, once they're ready and get to a point, to empower them and make them aware of these strengths that they have.
Yeah, I thought it was like the kind of like the chameleon aspect as it talked about how there's like this fluidity
that's it.
That they have this like this fluidity, this ability to kind of like go with, there's several identities as they choose to see it. And that could mean, like you mentioned, that could mean that, today, like around this group of people, like I identify as this, and then tomorrow I identify as that, or I always identify as both, or the three, races that I am, whatever. And that's a really cool thing is to, I think like being able to name that with our clients and like talk about that, is empowering to them, because I can imagine that they may experience a lot of kind of like an identity crisis. Like, I don't know who I am. Like, I look a certain way, but I'm also this. And so kind of like talking about like being able to name that like fluidity of their identity, I would imagine is like very empowering for the client.
Yeah, just validating that experience. As normal, as a strength, and not as a novelty either, because not as a novelty, not as a like a unique blip and like you're so ambiguous. Like just
exotic.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Multiracial people don't like being called exotic.
Well, yeah.
Not that I'm saying that,
Yeah.
but just from people that, from conversations I've heard, men, women, like, oh yeah, I prefer not to say, oh, you have such exotic eyes.
Yeah.
It's I just appreciate, who they are. And that was cool. You guys were talking about, the chameleon aspects of somebody with, multiracial background, because they have those perspectives from their different backgrounds, and they just can maybe find some commonalities that help them just be more effective to survive in society, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, surviving society. That's a good way to put it.
I think you said surviving earlier too. Or somebody
Said
Marvin.
somebody but it is a good way to put it, especially when considering aspects of discrimination, of and just the isolation that can come from that, where it's like, well, say I have one black parent, one white parent. It's like I'm too black to fit into white society and too white to fit into black society. Yet I experience discrimination because I'm black and I don't get any benefits of white privilege. So where does that leave me?
Right.
That sucks.
And you experience discrimination from both the majority group and also minority groups. So it's like you get like you're getting a lot of discrimination.
I didn't write down her name, but Root, who coined the term marginalized person, she's quoted in this. She coined it for multiracial people who exist on the margins of their own, of both of their identities.
Yeah. I saw that.
So, like,
margin.
we use marginalized people kind of every day to like talk about people who are disenfranchised, people who hold targeted identities, but it's specifically developed for people who are on the margins of their own identities.
Right.
And
That's
like
a good thing to bring up.
it was saying too, there's an underrepresentation of multiracial people in the media, and I just have to bring it up, obviously, because it's hot news. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry.
Oh yeah.
And I just think, it's so great that there's such a big example, and they are having a baby now, and I just think, looking from that little girls and boys all over the world, and whatever they identify as, finally, that there's a role model, that we have some type of representation of, and hopefully as time goes on, Meghan Markle comes out more and shares more about what it's like to be multiracial, living in how she does and her history and everything like that. So, I just thought
Yeah, no, it is. It really is. And it's crazy because I wrote like a couple statistics down, and like one of the ones in the book was that 46% of, granted this is only Mississippi, but Mississippi Republicans believed that interracial marriage should be illegal.
Yeah.
46%.
Illegal?
And illegal. It's not even like, oh, I don't agree with it. It's illegal. And that's insane. So I think your point of the representation is a really, really good one, because the more there are positive representation in our society and in our media, the more that hopefully that number will go down.
Yeah.
I think it's something really important as young people, all in this room, is how recent that 1967 decision is.
Yes. Oh my God, that's
like,
so crazy.
yeah.
I didn't know that until I read that.
That legalized interracial marriage. I don't remember the technical term.
Yeah.
I mean, look how it started, with slavery, how, if a slave was caught with a white woman, they received, like, no more than 39 beatings, no less than 30 or something.
Right.
That that it was illegal. It became
Just between like life and death.
illegal for, a slave to be with a white woman. We have to look at the origin and the history of where this started.
Yeah, that's so true.
And when people say, oh, slavery was so long ago, people are still acting like that affects things. Well, we had to undo what had been done, and it took until 1967,
Yeah.
to, even do something about this.
Yeah.
So,
And even though it may be like legally, there are still all of those like societal expectations that we still have to like undo. It's crazy.
Any final statements? We're almost to halfway point for.
Yeah. Okay, next chapter is
Counseling
Jewish Americans.
I'm glad that they included this one.
I am too.
Because, like, it was saying how there was a lack of addressing this group as, like, a minority and that it needs consideration for certain cultural things.
They're seen, typically maybe as being like white Caucasian from, physically, but there is, very distinct ethnic, religious, cultural perspectives and beliefs. Hebrew, Jewish people. I guess that's where it gets a little complicated too. Is there's like the Jewish religion, ethnicity, but then it stems from like the Hebrew people, like Israel. So I guess it's sticking more to like the modern of like
modern Jewish identity.
Yeah,
but then they still have that Middle Eastern, ethnic, ethnicity background. So it's
right, because you can be Jewish by religion only, and you could be, from literally anywhere.
Yeah.
But you could also be Jewish by ethnicity. So that's what I find interesting about this population is there's that like added element of, the ethnicity and the religion where you don't see that with really any of the other
Right. Like we can't.
populations.
You're Catholic. I'm Catholic. So like we're the Catholic religion, but it's not like we drop all that stuff and we just kind of culturally live as Catholics. It's, for other religions, it isn't really like that.
It's not.
It was saying how there's the Orthodox Jews, the conservative Jews, and
The Reformed.
and most today are either conservative or Reformed, where so many take such pride in their culture.
Yeah.
However, they don't really go to synagogue. They kind of pick and choose what they want to celebrate. Most of the Jewish friends I have do not fast. They're like, why would I do that? They'll celebrate the holidays that they want to. They'll still work on the holidays that they're not supposed to work on. This is an interesting population to consider when counseling because we have to assess, like it was saying, an older woman asked the counselor, "Are you Jewish or do you know about the Holocaust?"
Yeah.
A lot of them, especially older, carry a lot of this with them regularly. A lot prefer to stay, and that's a stereotype, but also there's some truth to it, to stay within their group, to build businesses together. To the media really is most Jewish people. It was businesses, media, and tailoring. I think we read in one of the Rothenbergs, and that some Jews don't really think about their cultural identity, or like that the Rothenberg, how Jews became white. A lot of them didn't even consider really that they were all that different from Italians or other groups.
It's so quick how generation will forget because we'll talk about it when we hear that how Jews became white, but that transition happened within like one generation.
Right.
We could actually just
we could talk about it
them.
together.
Yeah, we can put them together.
Literally.
Yeah. So I think about the Holocaust aspect of it in assessing for intergenerational trauma.
For sure.
And acknowledging that in the counseling room. And then also, though, acknowledging how quickly this transition came between, like, being disenfranchised and having barriers during immigration put up, especially during the 1920s and 1930s when anti-Semitism in America was at its highest. Or not highest, it's really high right now.
It is very high right now.
Yeah. But that transition from disenfranchisement, from genocide into one of the white groups, like how quickly that happened and unpacking kind of that.
So
I wish I
quick.
had a better point.
Sometimes when you think of Jews, you think of education, wealth, businesses that they have certain privileges over other minority groups. And other times when you think of you think Holocaust and anti-Semitism. All the things that they have to endure because of their culture. It's interesting, especially like I'm from Fort Lauderdale and Boca is very much like run by Jews, and we've got like this idea of Jews being wealthy and privileged and this and that, and then you look at some of the others of what they've experienced. It's like,
and then also how perceptions of all Jewish people as being power mongers, like that's anti-Semitic in itself,
right?
And unpacking that of like that's the model minority, but in a different status.
Yeah.
Of like, I can attack you, and I'm justified in attacking you because you
Because-
hold all of these power
Yeah.
in a like conspiracy, which is not true.
Mm-mm. And it's not okay. And I think that's such a good point, is that the like discrimination and oppression that the Jewish population faces is, I think, very unique than any of the other populations. Currently, at least, because it's like, when you think about it, it's more of like a, at least when I thought about it, it's not that there was like action discrimination. It was more like verbal, which is an action, but do you guys understand what I'm trying to say by that? But then I read that 59% of hate crimes are against Jewish population. And that really shocked me, because that was something that I just like wasn't aware of. So it's something that is still like, it's still prevalent. It happens. And it's like, there's actionable that is happening against that population.
Yeah, we kind of think about it more of stereotypes of like big bankers
Exactly.
and controlling Wall Street, but it's
Right.
not. It's like hate crimes against Jewish people are at an all-time high in America right now. Far
The
right
highest than any other group.
far right groups are coming up. So how we take that into the counseling relationship now, I think, is really difficult.
Yeah.
Too, because they offer us a different identity model for Jewish people. It's like 3 steps of just like not being aware, coming aware, and accepting.
Right.
It's like far right groups and far left groups, where it's like the far left groups want to support marginalized groups that don't necessarily identify with religious beliefs of Jewish people. So there's 2 extremes on either end. It's kind of tough, because they also want to support, let's say, people from Islam nations, and so you have countries that practice Islam versus Israel. So there's definitely heat coming from the right and coming from the left, big time.
Mhm.
It's a difficult thing, but I think what you're saying too about intergenerational trauma, I guess part of maybe their resiliency as well, is because I guess Jewish people have been, what's the best way to put it, is, stereotyped and enslaved for 3,500 years, so to speak. Well, if you want to get to the Old Testament, 2,000 years ago, historically, Jesus was around. 1,000 years before that, 1000 BC is the time of King David, King Solomon, with archaeological evidence for that. And 500 years before that, that's when they had the Exodus. And so this is an interesting group of people where pretty much for as long as they've known, they've been considered slaves and trying to fight persecution,
Disenfranchised.
So it's really neat to see the resiliency and the strength of that
And
group too.
how much your individual client in front of you identifies with that narrative.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah,
Because there's no
Individually,
single,
people know where
like
they're at.
Jewish identity. That's again goes back to us talking about how like this is such a unique population, because there's no like one identity. So it's like so important to explore that with your client and see like where do you identify yourself into this? Like what relates to you? Because it's so different for each person.
What I read that I thought was really interesting too, and my boyfriend says this all the time, and I always like roll my eyes. He's like, "There's not a lot of Jews left," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, why?" And he's like, "Because the Holocaust." And like, I would laugh because I'm like, you're not going extinct. There's plenty of Jews in the world. I always thought that was just whatever. But then when I was reading, it was saying that there is actually such a decrease. It went from 5 million to 4.6, or I might be wrong about that, because a lot of Jews marry into non-Jewish families. They don't raise their children as Jewish.
Yep.
There are a few other reasons why. So it is true that they
Yeah,
are.
they have low fertility.
I don't want to say die
Yes.
out.
Yes,
but
I saw that. Yeah.
you know, that is something to consider. Another reason why Jews, some of them, will have such a strong tie to their heritage, whether they practice the religious part of it or not.
Right.
You know, they really are so proud of the fact that they're Jewish and want to keep that up.
Yeah.
And it makes sense.
How you foster that cultural pride, that identity, that's important. And also understanding the background of like you're protective of this with good reason.
Because
Yeah.
like, help
what
me-
has happened.
What has happened
Yeah.
to you?
And the
yeah.
fact that there are actually people in the world that will say it never happened.
Oh my God.
Imagine being Jewish and people literally looking you in the
Like,
face and saying, Holocaust,
discrediting.
that was just made up.
If there's one thing to say in this, like, let's all just acknowledge the Holocaust.
Okay.
Happened,
For the
right.
record,
Right.
it happened.
It happened. Yeah. I mean, just so crazy. Like,
Like,
it's
imagine if there was a genocide against other people.
32% don't believe it or think that it was exaggerated. 32%. That is an
we have
enormous
less
amount of
So-
people.
I kind of want to come back to how Jews became white folks, because I think that's one of the ways in which we
Yeah.
can so easily deny that is in the fact that identity is socially constructed. Like, we see stereotypes and anti-Semitic perspectives of Jewish people being empowered, then it's like, how could there have ever been something so traumatic? There wasn't.
If they were able to come back
You've
from this.
constructed
right.
this narrative, like, look, successful white group, you've constructed this narrative to work against all of us.
Mhm.
Like, conspiring against your perceived conspirators.
Yeah,
And so, just again, like, Jewish people as white folks is completely socially constructed, and because that was able to be socially constructed, every other group in power has been able to have their whiteness formed for them.
For them. Yeah.
And when we're working with multiracial, multi-ethnic clients, like, we have to understand, like, this is all kind of just fake,
Right.
but
yeah.
this has very real implications.
It does. It still affects them just because it was constructed. Like, there are real consequences from that construction. And on that How Jews Became White Folks article in Rothenberg, I thought another interesting point that the author had made was about, did this happen? They brought in, like, class also, about how the middle class, like, did Jews become white folks because they were middle class?
Because they came middle class, or
Yeah.
did they become
middle class because they were considered white folks. And I thought that was, like, such an interesting kind of, like, thing to, just, like, think about. Because, like, class, we haven't really talked that much about class.
Yeah.
And, like, that we don't have time. But, like, that really does play, like, such an
Big part.
important part
Yeah.
of this.
And the author also framed the GI Bill after the war as the biggest affirmative action plan for
yeah.
white males. And I was
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
go off like it was. And practices that don't look discriminatory or advantageous to white people are in practice. And being able to take just a critical eye to that really shows that. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was a very enjoyable article.
Yeah, I like that one. That one was good.
That can be enjoyable.
Yeah, right.
Any final comments for Jewish identity?
I don't think so.
As
The only thing,
Yeah.
very quickly, the only thing I thought was interesting is that if somebody does identify with the Jewish faith, is that it could be a good thing as a counselor to consult, like, with their rabbi. I thought that was really interesting and something I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah.
Just like figuring out, like, where your client fits in with that identity, and if that's something that they really resonate with and is a big part of their identity, that it may be a good thing to, like, explore that and even talk to their rabbi on, like, discovering, like, what treatment looks like. So I thought that was cool.
collaborators.
That's all I had.
Okay, so as we enter, like, the
Final,
little
like-
above halfway mark, and we go into Rothenberg, let's pick up the pace a little bit.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, although I'm sure we'd love to talk about this all day. Okay, so we just covered how Jews became white folks, so we don't need to go back to that.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that one.
So for part one, we could go into the racial formations.
Racial formation.
We talked about this a little bit
Yeah.
with
Okay.
the
The
first
Hypo
chapter,
descent.
Hypo descent,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
of
Yeah, we talked about that.
the Louisiana case wherein she had black on her birth certificate, but she was like 132nd.
Yeah.
Black.
And, like, there's not a choice.
Right.
It
It
is
just
black.
is.
Yeah, so therein is another point of government has the power to define who you are, and that's just such a simple way to demonstrate how dominant society has the ability to define reality.
And race can be a social construction.
And race
It
is a social construction.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever you say, like, dominant society has the final word on it.
And how racial formations began by the question of if people of different races are the same family of man. That those like words really stuck out to me in that article about how people were like, oh, like are they even, you know, the same kind of men as white people are, which really goes back to show the whole social construction of
Like
race.
how human we are.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we did that one. Anything else on that one?
Good.
We did How Jews Become White Folks. Defining Racism, Can We Talk? Did everybody have that one, or was that like you pick one? I don't remember. Sorry.
I don't fully understand how these ones work, so I did read.
Okay, yeah.
all
So
of
we
them.
had to read these. Yeah. Okay.
So Defining Racism, Can We Talk? Something that I wrote down from this article was how there's so much like misinformation about race and racism, and the example that was used that I thought was that like really stood out to me was they asked children to draw like an example of a Native American, and the kids were like, I don't know what that is. Like they didn't know how to do it. And then when they said draw an Indian, the kids knew what it was, but thinking Native American, not somebody from India. And the one thing that all of the kids like incorporated into their pictures was feathers. And that really stood out to me because that really is the misinformation of people's identities and races and cultures. Like, and that's children. I mean, these are kids. Like, where are they getting this from? You know, like, so it just like really honed into me about how awareness is just like a really big piece.
Yeah, and you know, I'm actually going to tie this article into the one I read called "The Florida State Seminole Said: The Champions of Racist."
Okay, I didn't read that one.
Did anyone else read that
No,
one?
but
I
that
didn't
sounds
read that
so
one.
interesting.
So my high school actually back in Fort Lauderdale, we were originally called the Redskins
Wow.
for years and years,
Gosh.
and then we got changed to the Chiefs, and everybody was like, "Oh, this is so annoying. We can't wear our old shirts that say the Redskins." You know, like, and you know, that was just funny because it's a personal example. But
Yeah.
as far as Florida State goes, I mean, are you a football fan? Okay, I'm not.
The Assembled Tribes completely approved of everything. I'm not sure what the resource was.
Well,
on
it
that.
turns out it wasn't the Seminole tribes. So most of the Seminoles and Native Americans actually don't live in Florida. They live in, I think it was either Ohio or Oklahoma. So it turns out that everybody says it's fine because they approved of it. Turns out that they didn't. That there were two groups. I didn't write it down, but basically not the real ones, but like they didn't say it was okay, and they said that any type of representation of them is not allowed. And pretty much what they're doing, FSU and Redskins, you know, for high
And
school,
so many other sports.
so many other
Yes,
sports,
so many.
they're not acknowledging that what actually happened with Native Americans. You know, they're
Actually-
looking at it like those feathers.
Right. It's
And
it's a caricaturization of it. It really is cultural
what they're
appropriation.
saying is they're playing sports on their graves.
The author of that is incorrect. Because all the homecoming games, all the home games, there's actually ambassadors from the Seminole tribe. They're at the games. Chief Osceola, like it's all in recognition. The whole name Unconquered has nothing to do with our sports. It's all about the unconquered Seminole tribe not leaving the territory when Thomas Jefferson tried to kick them out.
I think a better point than parsing apart this is just the vast diversity that happens within Native American politics and Native American cultures. Because I've taken history courses on Native North America, and like how history has moved into political movements now, and because of the Trail of Tears, because of the mass migration we forced upon Native Americans, the fractionization that happened within tribes, like it's very difficult for us to understand Native American culture and Native American tribe politics because there's not solely those like representations that there used to be. We don't honor constitutions. We don't honor their sovereignty, which they still have.
Yeah.
So I think the better, more important takeaway point here is that maybe we just shouldn't use people as caricatures
Right.
at all.
Right. That was kind of like what I was from this is what I was getting is that like why use like somebody, you know what I mean?
Chief Osceola
Like,
isn't a character, just to clarify.
I know.
No, but
other
like a
situations,
mascot,
like the
but, like,
Redskins.
a mascot
Yeah.
is, you know, like that is a it's a character. Like
He's
whether
a
it's like
symbol. We
negatively
consider him
like
a symbol.
negatively like being portrayed or not, it's still like a character.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it's just something that I really want to go back and read.
Yeah,
that
I tried to
article.
read the article because
Yeah.
But there's
I
a-
hadn't thought about some of this, but you know, obviously he's not just spewing some BS. Like,
Well,
it's
actually, like,
either
yeah, they
that-
don't allow headdresses in the stadium. Like, if someone's wearing a
I
Native
think
American
these are pretty
headdress,
specific to
like,
not
they
only the
can't
Comanche
wear
tribe.
headdresses. Like, there's like very specific things that they have. Not to keep getting into FSU stuff, but there actually has been quite a bit of tribal communication. All the football uniforms, the symbols on their sleeves stand for fire, man on a horse, and arrow. From the actual Seminole tribe markings, like the whole unconquered thing. Like, so, like Chief Osceola, if you saw that statue of him holding, a flaming spear, you would not say it's a character. You'd say that is a powerful
Which is-
Native American
But how are
that we're
we
honoring.
using people to further gains? Because who profits from that but white owning sports,
It was
white
saying
sports
the branding
owners?
is
So
more
Symbol
important
tribe
than,
does.
than what
I
happened.
just
the
think it's
history.
yeah.
The branding is more important to them than the history.
Exactly.
Read
Well, that's
the
what
article
pisses me off
because
about
you're
the
gonna
new
learn a
Chief
lot.
Osceola symbol. It looks like a white guy. It looks like Elvis with a feather
So
instead
how-
of the original logo.
How we profit off of Native people's bodies,
Blame Nike
images.
for that.
That's I think something to think about.
Yeah, this was a good article. I wish somebody else had read it too. But
Yeah.
when you guys
Yeah,
have a little
sorry.
time,
Yeah,
please read it.
We'll read it.
I learned.
I might have to contact the author.
Yeah, we definitely will read it.
And,
Or just read it and get
no,
a new
I'll-
perspective.
no, I'm
'cause-
gonna read it, but if they're inaccurate, then they might need to be accurate. So
Well,
the
I
rest
mean,
of the country
Then there's
isn't
the
thinking
question:
for
how do you
six
know
Seminoles.
it's inaccurate?
Well, it's not what I know; it's what I researched personally, and what other tribal members know at the University of, Florida State University says. Not what I say. I'm not going to say David Duane says this. I'm going to say is what Florida State University says. What the Student Government Association that I also serve for, represents and says in regards to
Yeah,
our
I
respect
just think
for the
sometimes
Seminole
you
tribe.
have to be a little. Whatever, we need to like wrap up on this, but
Yeah.
like sometimes I think like
gives
just
you
because
deference.
just because like the FSU SGA says that they did like their research and maybe like looked into it, like that may be true. Like I don't know because I've never looked into that. I didn't go to FSU, whatever. But like just because
Bigger
like
than just
they
SGA,
did.
it's the whole, maybe from your outside perspective, not being a student there, no offense, but as a Florida State University student, you leave that university feeling that you're honoring
But
the
how do you know?
Seminole
But
tribe.
how do you know that
But
the
that's not
information
biased.
how do you know the information that they're giving you
It was
is
filtered.
accurate?
You're just believing it
Filtered
because you're a
through-
student.
Filtered through.
What
parents.
information
as-
are you talking about? So if you work hard as a student, if you make good grades, you're honoring the Seminole tribe.
Wait, but why?
Just as an indirect way of honoring your school. If you feel like you want to be a Seminole, you honor your Seminole. You may not be Native American, but have been accepted to this university. People that are accepted to that particular university, they don't just see themselves, I'm not just a University of Florida Gator, I'm not just a UCF Knight. A lot of people
say that about
have
any.
more personal, but it's different though, because what we're talking about, because this is a Native American tribe, it's real people that identify not as an animal, but as a real human being. And so I'm trying to communicate individuals that are educated there. There's an encompassing philosophy and belief where, we're trying to be more multiculturally aware of the Native American tribe of the Seminoles and not take advantage of, their mascot and not just be,
Well,
Jewish American
I'd love
school
to
there.
see, and I would hope that it would continue that, if for those that take such pride in being FSU students, that they have some type of education on the background of Seminoles and American, Indians and Native Americans. A majority of my friends graduated from FSU, and I don't think that they've been able to tell me one thing about
Right.
the background and the
Yeah.
history of it.
Sure, maybe
So
it's
just
just me.
because you belong to a school or something doesn't mean we have all the history
The accurate
and accurate
information.
information. And I do believe that the author of this article likely did some extensive research in order to be
To be
published.
published.
So let's just leave this here for now. I really urge everybody to read the article.
Yeah,
because it was great.
definitely will. Definitely will.
I think-
Thanks, Christina.
I think next is we're still in part 2, colorblind racism and white
Yes.
privilege. Because
Yeah, maybe we could tie these two in together.
yeah,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
and I think that they are, because unpacking the invisible knapsack was all about this author kind of substantially like saying like she gave this list of, I have access to housing opportunities, I have access to all of this, and colorblind racism acknowledged that article. They tied into each other, and also was like, so because you have access to housing, that means that a person of color does not have access to that same housing and has to pay higher for that rent. And so I thought that those two paired together and referencing each other was really interesting, because you can see the whole cyclical nature of things, where discrimination doesn't look like one policy, it looks like the ripple effects from each one of those policies.
Yeah,
That's a
great visualization.
And when I was home for the weekend, my mom and I were watching a show on Netflix. It's called Educated or something, and they have all these different little segments on different topics. And this one was real estate and like blacks. And my mom is a real estate agent, and basically it was saying how blacks were denied for so long to be able to own homes, and that the loans, their loans were different. That even if they could qualify with good credit, they were sold different loans where they ended up having to pay more, and it basically screwed them over. Also, that real estate agents weren't showing them houses in white communities, only in black communities. My mom told me something that I thought was so interesting and relevant is that up until, it wasn't even that long ago, I want to say like 80s or 90s, they finally passed some type of bill or something saying that real estate agents who showed any like discrimination or anything that had some serious consequences. And my mom says to this day, they'll even have like fake people call pretending to be like clients interested in homes, and they'll test them almost. And they'll say, oh, but I don't want any blacks in my neighborhood, so can you show me ones without blacks? Like, people will, it's their job actually to kind of like test. And my mom has been trained on this. She knows what to do. She can't give into it. She can't say, I'll make sure there are no blacks. And she also can't say there aren't any, or she just kind of has to like, diffuse the bomb and kind of not address what they're saying. So kind of equal rights, and they really are making huge strides in that now.
That's interesting.
Secret shoppers in the real estate.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah, I thought one thing that was interesting from colorblind racism, which, I mean, honestly, a lot of this like ties into so many of the other things, and like I really like related this to 13th, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, but how there's like the author termed it like new racism, about how it's more of like that subtle kind of racism that now exists, which is similar to that, like how I didn't even know about the loan thing, but that's a perfect example of this like new racism of how like, oh, well, just because you're black and even though you qualify for the exact same thing, we're gonna just subtly treat you different and give you something less just because of that.
And it's justified in different ways. It's not it's not the scientific racism model. It's the culturally deprived model of this is just like, you're going to bring in this crime. It's not your fault you're disenfranchised, but this is the actual effect. So we're just going to redline this area. You're not going to be able to fulfill this loan. And again, it's the ripple effect of that discrimination policy. It means that they won't be able to acquire good credit, and it means that their children won't be able to inherit property in the same way. And so, like, then that article like raises the question of, or at least this section raises the question of the conveyor belt of racism, of where we are now and how, as counselors, we start running in the opposite direction.
Yeah, every time I get on a conveyor belt now, I was at the airport this weekend, and seriously, every single time I get on one of those like moving walkways, that I think about it every single time. But it's honestly like such a great like reminder for me. Like,
I would get off and just walk. Be like,
no, I will not. I will not.
Okay. So let's start talking about part 3.
What articles did you guys pick?
So I picked, for many Latinos, racial identity is more culture than
I
color.
did that one too.
Anyone else pick that one? Okay. Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Yeah, sure. The main things that I got from that was talking about the census, really, which I know we mentioned, I think, a little bit before, but how like people feel like Latinos a lot of times like feel too racially mixed to be able to like identify with like one thing on the census, and how there's again that issue of like race versus ethnicity, and how a lot of time Latinos like identify more of like, as their Latin ethnicity than really their
white or black.
Exactly.
And this article really brings up a good point. Again, government has the ability to define who you are. So it's pulling back
Yep.
into that racial formation topic and model, because in the census developing like you're either white, black, or you're other unspecified, then that's going to determine the amount of resources that get allocated to this group. That's going to determine the voting districts and the way lines are drawn. And so it's just going to further disenfranchise people and this group specifically. When this is a large growing group in America, and its values should be taken to heart, and it won't be because the government either can't accurately assess this group for what they are or refuses to.
Yeah.
However naive perspective you want to take it.
And I mean, it seems maybe, kind of like simple, but having to even question what you check off on a piece of paper, like, makes you feel devalued as a human being, Like, I don't know, or I don't fit into any of these. Yeah, and like, that's what the article was saying, is that a lot of Latinos will end up just putting other because they don't know, like, what to put. And that makes you feel, like, oh, my government doesn't recognize, like, who I am and my identity.
Real heavy.
And what you guys were saying about how government and society has the say basically in constructing, like, your identity and your racial whatever, goes into the one I read, Los Intersectio? What was Intersectio?
Basically, the intersection.
Recasting moving selves. Basically, it was this girl giving her narrative. She's Arab and Cuban. And she was saying that when, people are always asking, what are you? What are you? She can't go anywhere without being asked that. When she's with Arab people, they really over-identify with her, and they say, which one are you more? And she says, none really. And they're like, I think that you're more Cuban because I feel really connected to our conversation, and you definitely are. Then she went to a deli where the guy was Arab, and she was wearing lipstick, and I think her name was Evelyn. And he said, nope, you definitely aren't. You're wearing lipstick. That goes against our whatever. Your name is Evelyn. And she's like, yeah, my mom's Cuban. She named me that. He's like, she sits on an airplane. Basically everything she does, everywhere she goes. She even said she went to Cuba. And even in Cuba, they said she's like, finally I'd have some freedom to just be whatever I wanted. And then they even said, no, you're not Cuban enough.
Wow.
So she's like, the moving self, recasting everywhere she goes. It's a point of conversation.
Yeah.
So, that ties into so many of the things that we've read.
The biracial identity.
Yeah, the multiracial identities, like, where do you fit in? Where does the government put you? For sure.
Yeah. Does anyone want to talk about anything else they read before we move on to part
I read
one?
about the immigration in the U.S., landscapes with legislative reform, and not too much to say about that. It was relatively short, just about how, like, groups that were dealing with now, like ICE and Border Patrol, a lot of those groups became, stronger bodies after 9/11 in regards to, those issues. So just in regards to just understanding, the timeline of our clients, when maybe they've immigrated, whether it was before 9/11, after 9/11.
Yeah, getting that timeline.
Yeah, how are they doing in terms of, being able to assimilate into the country while also holding on to their cultural identity, and just those landscapes of, legislative reform and how they make such a big impact on our clients.
Yeah.
Assessment and interviewing in like our office.
Gina Graham.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's Gina Graham.
Okay. Do you guys want to move on to the next part?
Yep, part 4. So this was the problem, discrimination, and then the new Jim Crow.
Mass incarceration.
Yes.
Yeah, this one was one of the most troubling ones I've read, and it goes into the film 13th as well. So if you guys actually want to,
Do we want to combine that
we
maybe?
could combine those.
Yeah, I think that'll be
My
smart.
notes for that are on my phone, so I'm just going to pull that up.
Okay, this is probably the article that I felt the most outraged and just like terrible guilt. Talking about how so many black men are put in prisons for the same crime that if a white man did it, they would have significantly less, repercussions, non-violent, and going into the war on drugs, and that, officers actually have the freedom to decide decide which area that they're going to pick to
Mhm.
profile, they actually get rewards of some type for getting the most people, the most bad guys into the prisons. They target areas in poverty. They go up to black people, that look suspicious. If they find drugs,
solely based on racial profiling.
Literally,
they
that's
end
right.
up, they can charge them for anything else they want. So if they also don't have identification, if they also, some other crime, they can just stack them up. And, they go back to their whatever and they say, look at all the people I got, and then they're applauded for catching the bad guys. And that the percentage of African Americans that are in prisons, it was talking about Barack Obama, that he made a speech on Father's Day, I think 2015, and his main argument was where are all the good fathers, kind of just saying like we need to be better fathers, that in African American homes specifically is where we see this, but he didn't ever bring up that a lot of them are in prisons, a lot of
Rightfully so.
unrightfully so.
Arrested for misdemeanors and expected to pay $10,000 in
For bail. Yeah.
Mhm.
Either admit to a crime you didn't do so you can go free, just take the injustice and go, or
Spend 10
spend
years in
time
jail.
in jail.
Mhm.
Have that on your
This system that we have, I briefly heard about it. I think I wanted to ignore it because it was just too painful to look into. But I interpreted it as like free. It's basically slavery. It's
Yeah.
like free
Legal
labor.
slavery.
Slavery is
Everything
terrible.
from graduation caps to Victoria's Secret to at Nordstrom, I guess they have some shirt that says behind bars or something. It's like inside. I don't know. It says something about that.
prison. That's Angela Davis's article, Masked Racism, talks about that, about what specific products are.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm
unfortunately,
switching
no.
No.
That's
It all just kind of like
I know.
It's all relevant because Angela Davis is interviewed in
In the 13th.
movie,
Yeah.
and she talks about the same thing of just this is a capitalistic invention that we have done that profits purely off of labor, majority black people of color, in that is allowed to happen because of the 13th Amendment. We profit from it. We wear it as fashion. We use it as technology.
and the funding.
We
that's
are
given to
complicit in
prisons.
it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's just a system that keeps growing.
And it really, like, in the problem, it talks about, like, the different levels of discrimination that we've even talked about in class, like, the individual, the organizational, and the structural. And, like, that is just, like, perpetuating those structural and organizational discrimination. I mean, that's literally what it's doing.
It is a beautiful monster.
Yeah.
Like, so clever. They found that loophole was intentionally done as soon as the 13th Amendment, as soon as slavery ended, and you still needed that economy. You still had the black bodies. You just used them in a completely different way. Shackles were replaced with handcuffs, and that's it. And
Yeah.
13th, the problem, New Jim Crow, Angela Davis's article, like this reading really made me think about just how recent everything of this is. And our lack of education through ethnocentric history courses, through
Our American history.
we don't
history
acknowledge
classes
any
do
of
not
that.
acknowledge these
Yeah.
things.
So like
Sorry,
especially in like colorblind racism and just like white privilege, like we want to hold these egalitarian ideas because we think this liberal idea of just work hard and you'll get it, you'll succeed. We think it's possible,
Right.
Because we're just
Sounds
so
good.
unaware, and it sounds good, and you want to be good for people.
I've realized that maybe as a white male, being in the U.S., I have that privilege, but it's not reality. I mean, for a majority of people, that maybe white males might statistically have a little bit more of an advantage to meet that reality. If you work hard, you'll make
The
a
myth
living,
of mediocrity.
Myth of mediocrity.
and that's what I'm really.
Meritocracy.
No.
That's something that's becoming very much more profound that I've learned through these classes. Like I know there's discrepancies between the opportunities of people, but it's a complete myth. I mean that doesn't apply for everybody. I mean you could work really hard. Somebody could work their ass off in school and make a 4.5 GPA. Have 2 jobs, and that student, if she's African American and has comes from a bad neighborhood and maybe doesn't have certain resources, like she's gonna be stuck. That sucks.
Something,
It's terrible.
yeah. When you were talking about the Angela Davis article and how really like the capitalist like society like really thrives from this kind of stuff. Something in 13th that that really stood out to me was this corporation called ALEC.
The
Oh,
lobbying
man.
group.
Yeah,
Piss me off.
crazy.
ALEC and CCCA.
Yeah, and I don't even remember what ALEC stands for. I should have written it down, but I didn't. But it's like the politicians and the corporations in a
Yeah.
private club, and they just like write the bills and legislation.
They
And
just,
it's like,
yeah,
how
they
can-
vote on, let's, have
How-
like politicians support this. The politician's like, I'll just take this.
It's like
literally, it's just like
Crazy.
copy and paste, and it's like
Oh.
It's so
have-
evil. You can't
So
imagine that
it's
it
the
actually
Roman
exists.
Empire. That's the downfall of the Roman Empire.
You don't
is when
understand.
business goes into our politics.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that is exactly what's happening.
yeah, and it happens today,
And
right now.
And throughout these articles, I've been thinking about the role of capitalism because in part one, it wasn't for part of our required readings for this one, but the formation of whiteness, that got done through social class
Right.
of poor white folks weren't benefiting from anything, so you had to make whiteness inherently beneficial. At least you're better than that slave.
Yeah.
Well, I should say that. I meant to say republic. The empire is not a good thing. When Caesar and
The Roman
Empire-
Republic.
the
Yeah.
Ro- more like the Greek Republic, Roman Republic. I wanted to correct myself.
But like the hand that money has in forming whiteness, in forming racism, in perpetuating it and profiting off of it,
Completely.
like that's intersectionality right there.
Mhm.
And then you cannot ignore class and power.
Betsy DeVos becoming our
Education.
educationer, head of education. That's exactly what you're saying. That's the most white rich lady, family that could possibly ever get involved, completely integrating themselves into our government education system. And I guarantee you something's going on behind the scenes where the mechanisms are continuing this discrimination, these stereotypes, and not having proper history in our books.
The existence of groups like ALEC like prove just how much of this does happen behind closed doors. Like that we're just gonna forever remain unaware of, and forever will perpetuate that myth of meritocracy of like, well, it worked for me, and so it can work for you.
Yeah,
like
right.
it's a
You're just not trying hard enough.
It's
Right.
and
But
like
people don't know about
at its
it.
core, it's a hopeful myth. It's like you can do it.
Like they want to believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to believe it.
But
And
unfortunately,
then it
It's
becomes
easier to
punishment.
just say somebody's lazy or they didn't try hard enough, and I did. I
right.
by grabbed myself by the boots or whatever that
Right.
expression is.
Yeah. Like I worked really hard. Like I deserve this. You're right. It's so much easier to do that instead of admitting that, like, systemically, our country.
To wrap your head
Yeah.
around how bad it is.
You're right. It is a lot easier to do that.
And in one article chapter, who knows, that I read, it was saying that, the reason that these things go on is because it's simply being American. It's the American way. It's when you take no action and you just go along like you're supposed to, that, we're just thinking that, exactly, like, everything we do perpetuates this, even if we're aware of it or not. It's the actually stepping outside of what we're supposed to do, what we're expected to do in order to make these changes. Things don't change because it's just too easy to keep them how they are.
Which is kind of ironic because the origins of the country of becoming America was to rebel against, governments and against institutions that were taking away our individual rights.
Mm-hmm.
And now those old European powers that be or whoever have brought that same, I guess, philosophy back into more mainstream US. And, don't worry about it. Just stick with this. Just deal with it. But, as an American,
But
we're supposed to, think outside the box, have these conversations, and to teach our clients, don't be content, try to find your rights and fight for them.
we have a mass cognitive dissonance as a nation. We were founded on that Boston Tea Party of saying, like, this is who we are. Right around, turned around, made the Three-Fifths Clause and said all men are created equal. All white landowning men of European descent are created equal.
Yeah.
But does it actually, Well, I guess it doesn't say that specifically.
It doesn't need
that
to
was
say
the
it
implication.
specifically.
Yeah,
That was
it's in
more
that.
than the implication.
Right.
Legislation did that.
But that was the
Slavery did
historical
that.
context of the whole entire world at the time, too. I mean,
But that's the thing is, like,
when the
we have to
Constitution was
recognize
written,
that. That's the
I mean,
issue.
where
Is
else
that
would the
the issue
world
is
be
that
if
we
there
don't
wasn't a U.S.
recognize
Constitution?
it. But we don't recognize that. That's the problem. Is that
Mhm,
whether or not
mhm,
that was
mhm.
like what the reality was at
You
that time,
recognize it.
it's we don't teach that.
Yeah.
Like we don't teach that
Only white guys.
we teach it where like, oh yeah, and then everybody was equal and it was beautiful and when we came here, when Christopher Columbus came here and he made friends with the Native American, that's what we're teaching. So we're not recognizing, like, regardless of what the reality was, we don't teach like what actually happened.
Even we say 1920 women got the right to vote. No, that's bullshit. White women got the right to vote.
Right. Oh,
Black
so
women
different.
didn't get the right to vote.
Exactly.
Hispanic women didn't get the
Yep.
right. Native American women didn't get the right to vote until well past that.
So
Yeah.
like recent.
Like 1970s.
Right.
We're leaving out so many important details in order to make it this magical
It's the myth of
American
meritocracy.
dream,
Exactly.
like this wonderful story of how
Every-
things came to be, but not what was left out and who was left behind.
And it just literally perpetuates that like dominant culture, that system.
Okay.
We're getting heated.
We're getting
I know, we
heated
have to,
and
like,
we
start
have
wrapping up.
20 minutes. So let's, I think that we covered the problem, New Jim Crow, and
Yeah.
the 13th Amendment, and masked racism in that article.
Yeah, we did.
For part 6, I read Civilize Them with a Stick. So I'm really glad that Native American identity is kind of coming up throughout this because it's really, really complex because of such a divisive history and because of the fact that, like, some of them are sovereign nations and not actually, like, Americans. Like, Choctaws are still Choctaws, but, like, we clearly are not native of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Like, clearly it doesn't honor that, nor the broad United States Constitution. So, Civilize Them with a Stick was a narrative about the author's experience as a girl on an Indian preservation boarding school, which was run by Catholic nuns of the Sacred Heart and Jesuit priests.
Wow.
Yeah, so boarding schools, I don't know what page it was on. Boarding schools on Native American reservations were the answer to the quote-unquote Indian problem. So the way to solve, you got a bunch of Native people here that you have signed contracts and treaties with. How do you honor that and how do you coexist with them? Make them white folk. So they did their damnedest at trying to make them white folk. And through that came Christian missionaries. That came just really harsh education practices where children were ripped away from their family. Like, I mean, ripped in the most violent sense of the word. Ripped away from their families, not allowed to have contact with home, not allowed to speak their native languages, not allowed to practice their religions. And we still do it. There's so many moves to save the Choctaw and the Cherokee languages, and they're dying. And there's over 500 distinct native languages that are going to go extinct very soon. So if you have time to read Civilize Them with a Stick, I highly suggest it because it's really painful too, of just the extent to which this is like a genocidal practice. It feels like it is one of the purest senses of dominant culture saying what you can and cannot be, and how violent we will get to go there. Because she describes physical and psychological torture at the hands of these Jesuit and Catholic nuns. Like, it's and that's something to really understand when working with our Native clients, especially for me as a white Catholic. Like, I understand, like, I try to understand as much about the past as the present, where if I'm working with a Native client who has family history or went to a boarding school, that dynamic matters. How you heal the past in that moment matters. And that's through, like, integrating cultural techniques of healing and everything, but it's not going to come by not being aware of this. Yeah.
Wow. I definitely want to read that one.
It's
I
a-
wish that I did so I can contribute something, but thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah,
That
thanks.
was great.
The one I read for this section was Crossing the Border Without Losing Your Past. This one was really interesting. It was talking about a Mexican immigrant, and just really, like, the main topics were just the acculturation and the assimilation that we've talked about a lot, but just about how it's, in the title of it, Crossing the Border Without Losing Your Past. It's like, how do you integrate, like, your native traditions, your native culture, while living successfully in this new culture that has a lot of like great things for you. That's why you came here, but at the same time has a lot of discrimination towards you and is not set up for your success. So it's kind of like this dichotomy of how do you navigate that as an immigrant, and specifically in this story, it was a Mexican immigrant, just talking about the acculturation process and the assimilation process and his feelings throughout that experience. So it was an interesting article.
Jeez.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I read the first one in the part Indian tribes continuing quest for survival. I guess some of what you were basically saying a minute ago, just in terms of like knowing where they are and like knowing the history, and just like a little tidbit, like they lost approximately 90 million acres of land from as people move west, and like you were saying earlier, to be aware of like our own religious perspectives in terms of how they see maybe not religion, more like spiritual connections of how they're, I'm not going to say spirit animals, and I'm not going to speak for them, but just to be open to understand, like, how do they seek their own spiritual health, and just, like, the constant, limitations of their rights, where they're not even, Native Americans, in our Supreme Court, most of their tribes and reservations aren't recognized in the Supreme Court in the U.S., so it's just living in the land, and still not even being, it's basically like an undocumented immigrant. But you've been living here, but your people lived here for 10,000 years.
You originated.
But alienated from their land too because of the Trail of Tears. And Andrew Jackson just moving forward with that, despite the fact that the Supreme Court said that it was not constitution. Andrew Jackson said, I'm going to do it anyway, and he shuts all of that out. So the disenfranchisement that comes from being isolated on land that isn't yours,
right.
and losing that spiritual connection to the land too. So in terms of intergenerational trauma and understanding tribes as they exist now, it's, are you living on your land?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's like their home country, like their homeland, so to speak.
Okay. Anything else on this section, or do we want to move forward? Okay.
I read an article called Black Bodies in Motion and in Pain, and it was the author was just reflecting about the murders that happened in a church in Charleston, and she was just saying that as long I wrote down some things that a black body in motion is never without consequences. Black bodies seem to be labeled as dangerous weapons. Black bodies in motion have been deemed a threat. Black bodies are becoming battlefields in which horrors are routinely executed, that we barely have the time to grieve and mourn because chances are there's another one right around the corner. That, if we even start to mourn the loss, another one happens. It never ends. And just, that never safe.
Yeah. That's heavy.
It was. It was not a very long one, but, I mean, the content was, heavier than some of the even longer ones I read. Do you guys want to talk about Michael Brown?
Yeah.
Let's talk about Michael Brown.
Yeah, I know that was like such a short little like one pager, but
I wish it was longer.
But man, just like, and it's just so true about how the way that particularly black men are depicted in the media.
And we say black men, he was a teenager.
A child, right? A black child. I mean, Trayvon Martin. I mean, like you can.
Tamir Rice, 12 years old.
It's insane. It's ridiculous. You're right. Black children
that term,
also.
Super Predator from 13th, which is
Yeah, and it's just like, I mean, even like when
terrible.
you're not using like really like intense language like that. I mean, in Michael Brown's case, it's like, oh, he wasn't angelic because he smoked weed.
He listened
And
to hip-hop
He
loud.
listened to rap music that had vulgar language in it, and he had shoplifted before. That's
of
not
those
unique.
I knew
Isn't
girls, most girls in the 7th grade.
white
females
females
could say all the
the
same.
same thing, and so it's like that is not a unique thing to this person, to this population.
Nor does it
use-
warrant a death sentence.
More importantly, more importantly, because somebody does that, that doesn't mean that you can shoot them.
Yeah.
For no reason. So, but I just thought that, like, that was, we forget that as a society. Like, when we hear that, I'm like, oh, yeah, I mean, he didn't deserve that, but, he just, like, wasn't the best kid or whatever. What?
It's like another big argument that goes into that is, every time that a black person is pulled over by a police officer, and it ends in their death, the question isn't always why did the police officer act that way. It was, oh, why did that black person
Resist
look
or
like
whatever.
he was looking for something in his pocket? Why did he argue in the first place? He shouldn't have argued.
Right.
He should have complied.
Yeah,
Right,
what did
you
they
know?
do for to warrant? the
Yeah,
cop?
exactly.
It's not why
It's
did
always on the victim. Yeah.
The truest
the
form of
victim.
victim blaming,
Mhm.
and just like never. Why did not using a turn signal become a death sentence?
Yeah.
And that is a reality that like I will never face as a white woman.
Yeah.
Being pulled over by the police, no matter like how much I don't like being pulled over by the police.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Somebody I was
And-
telling to about this article the other day, and I was telling them about how she was pulled over for not using her blinker, and then she ended up arguing with the police officer. Or no, the one where the man was he had loose cigarettes.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it was like the first opening
Yep.
thing we read,
Yep.
and the person said, "Well, why were they arguing with the cop? Why maybe they shouldn't have been arguing with the
Eric
cop."
Gardner.
And I was like, "Are you kidding? That's what you took from this whole thing?
Mhm.
Why did they not just say, okay, take me to jail for these loose cigarettes?"
Right.
And that in 13th points this out too. But the video, we remember him going, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe."
Yeah.
It starts out with him saying, "Why are you guys always bugging me?
Mhm.
Why me? Day after day, you're always bugging me." Those cops knew him. This was just
knew.
constant torture. And so, do you just lie down and say, "Yeah, he
Right.
had been cited for that multiple
Yeah,
times
that's
before.
right.
He was literally just being targeted."
Yeah.
For a very, very minor offense. If you want to criminal, like,
He said he couldn't breathe.
yeah, he said, and it was warranted, moved as a homicide, and like I'm having an emotional reaction to this right now because I think that right now, as like white people in this society, Black Lives Matters is like our primary movement, and that incorporates the new Jim Crow, understanding Michael Brown, understanding Sandra Bland. Like, if we can just at least acknowledge that those who are treated as the least amongst us are human,
Mhm.
everyone benefits from that.
Yeah.
And that's how 13th kind of ends.
Mhm.
Sorry that I went off.
No.
No,
That's part of this. Yeah. Yeah, we should start
Yeah.
wrapping up.
Wrapping up. We skipped over part 7.
Oh right.
I did People v. Hall, which was essentially the California Supreme Court said, Chinese people, Black people, Native American people, you're not allowed to testify in court against a white person. That's it.
Yeah.
We literally legislated that.
Yep.
So government has the right to mandate your experience.
And that goes back to us talking about like how we just our history doesn't teach us that.
Mhm.
Those are the things that we leave out of education.
Like mine was an act prohibiting the teaching of slaves to read. That's left out.
Oh, that's
too.
the one I. That's the one I did. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Because
We don't want them too educated.
right, and what I read in there is that literally it says because they want to keep slaves in hand. Like that was the reason.
And stop.
Mm-hmm.
That was like the reason for it.
Or if they get too smart, they might turn against us.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
they figure out what's really going on.
Right.
Yet the natural state of the black man was to be enslaved.
Yes.
So
So
that
there you
level
go.
of comment.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Did you read anything for part 7 that you want to talk about? That we haven't?
No, nothing we haven't already covered.
Well, we're getting to time.
Yeah.
We'll go over part 8 real quick.
Is there any?
Part 8, we did mass racism, we did
Okay,
Michael
we mixed
Brown.
it in, Yeah.
and then we have.
I talked about my Florida State Seminole.
Yeah, and then we pretty much have like integrated 13th into like,
Into
a lot of our
everything.
discussion.
Mhm.
So I mean, if
New
there's
York
not,
Times, the last thing,
Mhm.
is just
Oh,
the Supreme Court in 2013 voted, it was like 5-4 vote to allow states to make their own voting laws. And I think it's like 13
And
something
in states that are known for discrimination.
Yeah, Texas, started changing their laws. I'm sure, probably, was it South Carolina, North Carolina, the last couple of years was requiring, like,
I
Redistricting.
think it was not.
yeah, more, like, identification or
Mhm.
something like that.
Voter ID laws are cropping up. And I'm glad that we're ending with this right now because of Georgia's upcoming election and just the midterms that are happening like next month.
Yeah,
of
this is big.
Voting rolls being purged, and they're being purged substantially, like
What's going on?
majority black. So people who are registered to vote right now,
Yes.
when they go to check on their registration status, or they'll arrive to the poll to cast their vote, they're mysteriously deregistered to vote.
What?
Yeah, so that's actually something that's really huge right now. Look it up with the Georgia election.
Whoa.
The registrar who's in charge of the Georgia election is running for governor in Georgia. So he's
Oh,
literally in
man.
charge of the process that is wiping black voters off the register. And this is happening.
That is a huge issue. I bet Alex behind that somehow.
It's happening across the country with like individual voting offices. So this is a really big example of how, in effect, how we maintain power in effect by keeping people from the polls.
Similar, but not quite the same. Not voting, but Adam Putnam, who was going to run for governor, he was our agricultural commissioner in Florida for over many years. While he was agricultural commissioner, him being in office, his office allowed all sorts of, just things to go crazy. EPA regulations, people would buy firearms that there's no background checks, and so it's the systemic, racism and control that's.
We like to think of this as like it's hard to imagine that there are people behind the curtain who do this, like Alec. But then there's also individuals sitting in front of a computer doing this, who are just, and this is discrimination. The problem discrimination talks about this with a lot of discrimination just comes from someone filling out their job description.
Right.
And that is something really important to
They
remember.
probably don't question.
They don't question. It's
Yeah.
like, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
I also have a job and family to keep.
Right.
I was told to purge these records. I was told to deny you this loan based off of what I've been doing
Right.
for my whole past. It's nothing personal.
Right.
I'm not racist.
Yeah.
And that's immensely difficult right now too. And I think we're all going to come to terms with that, with like how we feel about ICE and and how we feel about not doing enough. It's like I was just doing my job. I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure.
All right, you guys. So we're about time.
Yeah. Yeah, we have like 3 minutes. So
Yeah.
any
Any
last thoughts?
feelings?
A lot of feelings. Frustrated, overwhelmed, all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult. I don't know. And thinking about it's sometimes it's hard to think about it from like a personal lens versus like as a counselor.
Yeah.
So that's another thing.
Yeah,
that I
we're two
think
different
about.
people,
Yeah.
and we have to like we're us, and then we're us
As
as
like
a
a counselor, that's like a role that we have. So
Yeah.
it's like interesting on how to like incorporate that into everything that we've talked about and learned.
It's a continued process.
Maybe we can say one positive thing we took away from this reading, like either a strength you didn't realize the culture had, or something like neat in legislation, or like action that gets taken. Like one positive thing I would say was honestly watching 13th, because Ava DuVernay has been able to like take that platform and like there are advances in technology, advances in social media that have been bad, but also I've gotten a lot of my multicultural exposure by just following people on social media.
Yeah.
And I think that's I think we live in a really unique time, and I'm really excited to see how platforms get used for social change. And 13th was such a really heavy but really good example of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I feel like my positive kind of goes along with that is that, and maybe this is just like my experience and like where I'm at in my life, but I feel like in this day and age, we are having these kinds of conversations more than ever because of things like social media, because of things like hashtags. I mean, just like a hashtag in and of itself. And so that is, as much as this is so discouraging to me, that is encouraging because that's where it begins, is that awareness. People being made aware of what is actually happening.
1 minute. Culture, exciting strengths.
Okay. Mine's simple. It really goes back to Sue and Sue. And Rothenberg is a great, teaching how the history of all these things in these different groups, and incorporating the Sue and Sue, taking that knowledge, that history, and learning how to help our clients. It's one thing to know the history; it's another to know the little techniques of how the considerations for different cultures.
Yeah,
So to be a better counselor.
Mine, I guess would say it was yeah. No,
I mean, it's okay.
no,
if
no.
there's something.
Well, I want to apologize, I guess, to you, but also bring that as an important point in terms of when you were talking about FSU and the Seminole tribe and that being our mascot. I should have been. It's important as a counselor, even if I know something that is, I've experienced, factual information that, like, I know this, there's always more to know.
So humility.
Yes,
would be your
humility.
strength.
Yes. yeah, practice humility a little bit more. So,
Okay.
and and always be learning.
Always be learning.
All right.
All
Good
right.
job, you guys.
Yeah. Hold on, Dr. Northworthy. I've got to close out this computer.
Bye.
Yeah, she's still watching. And I got my password wrong.
See you in class.
Yeah, see you in class.